The scripture lesson today is from Revelations, chapter 3, verses 7 through 11. Write this letter to the angel of the church in Philadelphia. This is the message from the one who is holy and true, the one who has the key of David. What he opens, no one can close, and what he closes, no one can open. I know all the things you do, and I have opened a door for you that no one can close. You have little strength, yet you obeyed my word and did not deny me. Look, I will force those who belong to Satan's synagogue, those liars who say they are Jews but are not, to come and bow down at your feet. They will acknowledge that you are the ones I love. Because you have obeyed my command to persevere, I will protect you from the greatest time of testing that will come upon the whole world to test those who belong to this world. I am coming soon. Hold on to what you have so that no one will take away your crown. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. Thank you, Julie. I invite you to turn with me in your Bibles to Revelation chapter 3. We'll get verses 7 through 11 as we move on into lesson number 3, or installment number 3 in our current sermon series that I've entitled Still, Learning to Hear When God Speaks. You can see where we've been so far and where we'll be going. And as I've told you at the beginning of each of these, the reason I've done this is because one of the most common questions that I get from people at different stages in their life is, how do I know when God is speaking to me? How do I know what God is saying? How do I know how to follow? And so as we're learning in this series, there are actually 7 different ways that God speaks to us. And we've looked at some of the most obvious so far. We've looked at how God speaks to us through scriptures. And then last week we talked about desires. And I think it was a new thing for some of you to realize that some of the desires that God places in our heart are actually evidence that God's speaking to us, that He's pulling us in a particular direction. And so we differentiated worldly desires from holy desires. Worldly desires are ones that are selfish. They're ones that are there to make us feel bigger and smarter and more important. But holy desires, on the other hand, are things that God is moving us through to try to help us further His kingdom and come closer to Him. And so we learned that God's plan for our lives tends to unfold only as we live out our faith in day-to-day obedience. In other words, much to my chagrin and maybe to yours as well, God doesn't just sit down with us one day and go, okay, Brian, here's the 10-year plan I have for your life. And here's step A and step B and step C. But instead, it's more of a situation where we wake up each morning and as we seek God and we say, God, I want to walk in the path that you have for me today. What are we doing today? God begins to lead for that particular day. And then the next, and then the next. And so we learned 3 guidelines there, that we need to move confidently, we have to proceed flexibly, and then finally we have to live in that resolutely. So today we want to talk about the next way that God speaks, which is through doors. Doors that open and doors that remain closed. I think I've told you before that one of the points of connection my father and I shared when I was growing up was that we both really enjoyed the cartoon that was very popular back in the 80s and 90s called The Far Side. Anybody remember The Far Side? Okay, yeah, a lot of you do. The guy that designed that wrote those, was a man by the name of Gary Larson, and he just had kind of a different sense of humor, and it was a humor that my father and I both got and we enjoyed, and we had kind of a tradition throughout my time at home where I would buy him for Father's Day one of those little day-by-day calendars, desk calendars, where you'd rip off the page for the day, and it would have a Far Side comic on it, and Dad would bring those home from work and leave them on next to my plate at dinner time, and we would sit and enjoy those. And this was always one of his favorites, and it became one of my favorites because my brother and I were both in gifted class at school, and my dad just thought that was hilarious because of all the dumb things that my brother and I would do in real life. And so I don't know how well you can see this, but it's a classic. There's very few words in it, but you can see there's a sign down in the lower right-hand corner that says Midvale School for the Gifted, and we have a young man who's supposedly a student who's trying to go in the door that clearly says pull on it, and he's pushing very hard against it. The gifted kid doesn't read the sign. He doesn't get what's going on, and that's funny to me in a spiritual sense, because I think if I'm like most of us, I hope I'm not alone in this. I can look back and I can see where I have spent weeks and months and sometimes years of my life pushing very hard against a door that clearly says pull and wondering why God isn't moving and why my life isn't going the direction that it's supposed to. And this is, in some sense, what the writer of the book of Revelation is saying to these churches. Most people tend to see the book of Revelation as a book of prophecy in the sense that it predicts certain things that are going to happen. And I think in the church, the capital C church as a whole, we've misused this particular book of the Bible over the years. We've tried to use it as a way of predicting what's going to happen in the world. And so we get very caught up on what I consider to be pretty inconsequential issues, like who is the Antichrist? And when will the Antichrist rise? And how many years will the Antichrist reign before such and such happens? And do we get raptured out, or do we stay here through the tribulation? And when people ask me these questions, I'm usually pretty blunt about it. I just say, I don't care. I don't care, because what I'm concerned with is, what am I supposed to be doing today? What do I need to be doing tomorrow? The rest of that stuff is in God's hands. And really, it's not the point or the purpose of the book of Revelation. It is originally known in the old Bibles. If you have an older King James Bible, a lot of times it will, instead of Revelation, it will say the Apocalypse, or the Apocalypse of John. Apocalypse is a Latin word that means ending or unveiling, revelation. That's just another way of saying that. And it's written by, as you might have guessed, somebody named John. Most Bible scholars believe it was John the Apostle, the one who called himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. So he spent those 3+ years walking and talking and following and interacting with Jesus, and he went on to serve the church throughout the rest of his life. It was written about 60 years after Christ's resurrection, and most people believe that John was a very young man, and we're talking young when he began to follow Jesus. He was probably somewhere between 14 and 16 years old when Jesus called him from his fishing nest. Come and follow me so you can be a fisher of man. And so that would have made John somewhere between 74 and 76 years old when he wrote this particular book of the Bible. And he wrote it in less than ideal circumstances. He was in exile. He was exiled by the Roman government on a place called the Isle of Patmos, which would have been off the coast of Ephesus in Turkey. You can see there next to the big red arrow. It's just a tiny little island out in the middle of the ocean. And church tradition says that John was exiled there because of kind of a miracle. He was scheduled to be executed publicly, like all of the rest of Jesus' disciples who were still alive at that particular point in history. And the Romans decided the way they would do away with John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was to boil him in oil. They would boil him alive in oil, and he would die that way. And church tradition says they boiled him in oil and it didn't kill him. And the Romans were so puzzled, and they thought, well, maybe he really does have God on his side. And so they said, well, just exile him. And so John was probably in a lot of pain, probably had a lot of scars and other things he was dealing with, but he was alive. And he wrote this on Patmos as an older man. Why was this book written? Believe it or not, this book was not written to tell us future events, but instead it was written to this original group of people to comfort, to encourage, and to challenge persecuted believers. In other words, it was written to persecuted believers who were suffering the same things John had suffered and who were pushing on a door that clearly says, pull. David Malik talks about this, and he says, he gives us some guidelines as to what we need to be looking for as we look at the book of Revelation. And he says, since the churches he was writing to did not know when Christ would return, and none of us knows either, it is as relevant today as it was then, if we read it for what it's intended to be. Our foundational thought for today is that God often speaks just as clearly through things that don't happen as things that do. Even when doors don't open or they're delayed in opening, God is speaking through that. Mark Batterson puts it this way. He says, this is often how the will of God works. We walk through a door and we think, this is my final destination. But it's actually a door that leads to a door that leads to another door. One of the most mysterious and miraculous ways in which God reveals his sovereignty is by the opening and the closing of doors. And you don't have to be following Jesus for very long in your life before you learn about the frustrations and the puzzlement that go with opening and closing of doors. And so today we're going to be looking at 3 steps for navigating doors. Doors that remain closed, doors that open, doors that we're not sure that we should be moving through at any particular time. And we're going to learn that we need to start by acknowledging our need, then we proceed in faith, and then once we've walked through that door, we need to hold our ground. Our one-sentence sermon for this morning is that God manages doors in our lives, and He does it as a means of guiding our lives, of strengthening our faith, and finally of increasing our witness to others. So we begin with the idea of acknowledging our need. John writes this. He says, "This is the message from the one who is holy and true, the one who has the key of David." Kind of mysterious stuff, kind of weird language. We're not too sure what to do with that. Interesting chapter in history from the midst of World War II. In 1940, British intelligence or Allied intelligence captured a machine that they called Enigma. They captured it from German forces, and they realized very quickly that this was a machine that was used to translate the intelligence or the instructions that were being sent to the German troops at different locations across the theater of operations during World War II. And so they were very excited about this because it was obvious that what you did was you took a message and you put it in the machine and you would punch in a code, and then it would reveal what this series of letters and numbers actually meant. But the frustrating thing about Enigma was that the Germans realized these machines might fall into enemy hands, and so there wasn't just one code that had to be broken, but rather every day there was a message that went out and said, these are the settings that you set the Enigma machine to, and once you do that, the code will be revealed. And there was such complexity to the machine that there were hundreds of thousands, even millions of different options that you could set that machine to, and if it wasn't exactly right, the message would not come out correctly. And so the Allies set about going to Oxford and Cambridge and enlisting some of the brightest minds of the day to figure out how do we crack the code of the Enigma machine. And so people tried their hand at it, very many brilliant people, but it was finally a very strange man, often overlooked man by the name of Alan Turing, who cracked the Enigma code. And he did it by developing a very primitive form of what today we would call a supercomputer, and he called it Banderismus. And what it was able to do was it was so powerful it could go through billions of different combinations of numbers and letters until it found the particular one for that day that would crack the Enigma code for that particular moment. In other words, it opened a particular door on that particular day. That door wasn't valid the next day, it wasn't valid the day before, but for that day, the door was open. And of course, it changed the entire course of World War II. The Germans were stunned to realize that the Allies began anticipating their movements, and they knew what was going on because Banderismus allowed them to know what the battle plan was. When asked about this years later, Turing reflected and he said, you know, sometimes it's the people no one imagines anything of who do the things that no one can imagine. In other words, if we go in with an arrogant mindset, many times we miss the idea that's right in front of us. So we're told about this key of David. The word here in the Greek for key is kleis, and believe it or not, it just means key. Sometimes that just happens. Greek words actually just mean the same things as they do in English, but what we want to do also is dig into what is the cultural meaning of a key. And as you can see there, metaphorically, this word kleis, that means key, is used specifically in the New Testament to denote power, to denote authority, and to denote a knowledge. And so what John is talking to these churches about is that God has the power, He has the authority, He has the knowledge that you need. You're confused, you feel like a nobody, you feel like you've been abandoned, but God has the key. He has exactly what you need. The readers of this, with their Jewish backgrounds, would also have realized that this referred to a biblical character by the name of Eliakim. Eliakim was not a particularly important person. He had one job and one job only, and that made him an important and powerful person. And his job was he walked around behind King David throughout the palace complex, and he wore a key on a chain around his neck. And that key was a skeleton key to every single door throughout the palace. And so when David was walking, he didn't have to stop and go, okay, who has the key? How do we get in this door? He would just stand aside, and Eliakim would come up and take the chain off of his neck. He would unlock the door, David would open the door, the king would open the door, they would walk through, and it would be shut behind them. So there's a very clear message that's being sent by God through John to the people in the persecuted church, which is, I got this, guys. I have the key on the chain around my neck. I will open the doors when they need to be opened. We can see Jesus alluding to this in Matthew 16 as he's speaking to his followers. And he says, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you forbid on earth will be forbidden in heaven, and whatever you permit on earth will be permitted in heaven. In other words, if you're doing what I ask you to do, doors will open when they're supposed to, and they will close when they're supposed to. You don't have to worry about those details. Here's our first idea, is that it's only after we admit that we bring nothing to the table that we receive what we need to accomplish God's will. Many times doors stay shut in our lives because we're standing there and we're pushing on them and we're saying, nope, God, I've got this, don't worry about it. God, I've got the timetable in mind. I understand what doors are supposed to open and what ones are supposed to stay closed. And God's saying, I got the key right here. But until you have that revelation, until you understand I'm the one who's in charge, we'll wait. We'll just stand here. So our first key point is that intelligence is transformed into wisdom. In other words, something we can use, something of eternal value, only after we properly acknowledge its source and only after we determine to walk accordingly. Only after we realize, I don't have the key, I don't know which door I'm supposed to go through, I don't know when I'm supposed to go through it. Somebody else has to crack the code. Somebody else has to let me know. James talks about this in chapter 1, verse 5. He says, you know what? If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault. And when you do that, it will be given to you. John MacArthur puts it really well. He says, it's not intelligence, but intellectual pride that shuts people out of the kingdom, that leaves them on the other side of the door. Intelligence is a gift of God, but when it's perverted by pride, by this idea that I have it under control, I know what needs to happen, then it becomes a barrier to God, because trust is in the gift rather than in the giver. Trust should always be in the giver, not in the gift. So step number 1 is acknowledge our need. Step number 2 is that we need to proceed in faith. God continues to speak to the churches, and he says, I know all the things that you do, and I've opened a door for you that no one else can close. There was a not-so-great movie that was pretty popular that came out in the early 90s called Backdraft, and it was about firefighters in New York City. It was a Ron Howard movie, and it was kind of silly, kind of overblown, but one of the fascinating things to me about it was that it tapped into fire science, and I didn't really understand how fire worked very well, and so it was interesting to me. But they had an arsonist, a serial arsonist that they were trying to track down, and the insidious thing he was doing was he was setting these fire traps in buildings to kill firefighters. And the way he was doing it was he was creating a very low-grade fire that would build up heat very slowly over the course of time. And so a fire alarm would go off, and the firefighters would come, and they would see smoke coming out from under the door, and so they would burst through the door, and they would create something called a backdraft. And what a backdraft is when you've created a fire that has what we call incomplete combustion. In other words, there's not enough oxygen to fully feed the flames, but the heat is building, and the potential power is building. And so when somebody breaks through the door or breaks a window, it sucks a whole bunch of oxygen in. It creates this enormous fireball that blows out, and it destroys everything around us. And so they were trying to teach the firefighters to be careful until this arsonist was caught. And they told him to do 2 different things. They said, number 1, look around the bottom and the sides of the door, and if there's yellowish or brownish smoke that's coming out, there's potential for a backdraft. And number 2, they taught them to feel the door. If the door is hot, if it's very, very hot to the touch, chances are you don't want to open that door on your own. We want to figure out another way to access what's going on in that room. The man who was teaching the firefighters this said that fire is a living thing. It breathes, it eats, it hates. The only way to beat it is to think like it. Part of what John is doing here is he's giving them a window into the mind of Christ. And he's saying, in order to follow Christ, you have to think like Christ. You have to show the respect that is necessary so you don't walk into a bad situation. The word here for door in the Greek is an interesting one, thura. is obviously means a door, but it's also used metaphorically in the Greek to indicate an opportunity. And in the literal sense, it also means shield. And it's referring to a particular type of shield that everybody who read this letter or heard it being read would have been familiar with because they were in Roman-occupied territory. Romans carried a shield that was called a thura. And you can see a picture of it there in the graphic. It was a large shield. It was about 5 feet tall and 3.5 feet wide. And so for a man, a grown man at that particular time in history, it would have been almost the perfect size that you could hold it up in front of you. It had 2 straps in it. You put your forearm through, and you could crouch down a little bit, and you could hide behind it completely. And Romans were known for when they would walk into a siege situation where you would have archers up above you and people throwing spears. They would go into what's called testudo formation. You can see that in the picture there. Testudo is an Italian word for tortoise. So they would form this tortoise formation, and the men in front would hold the shields up in front of them, and then all the men behind them would put them up over their heads, and they would all crouch down, and they became like a tortoise hiding in the shell. But what everybody would have also been familiar with is the men who were standing behind. Those men were the commanders, and they would stand a little bit behind, out of range of the archers and the spear throwers, and they would watch, and they would wait for the appropriate time when they were reloading, when the enemy was changing positions, and they would signal at that time, put down your shields, charge, we're moving forward. So if you were a smart soldier, you would stay hiding behind that door, behind that thura, behind that shield until the commander, who could see the situation better than you could, would say, all clear, time to move through the door, time to move forward. This idea is talked about by Paul in Ephesians chapter 6, when he's talking about putting on the spiritual armor of God. And he goes through all of the things we need to do to protect ourselves from the enemy. And then at the end he says, in addition to all of these, hold up the shield of faith. Go into testudo formation. Why? Because you've got to stop the fiery arrows of the devil. Trust God to watch. Trust God to understand the situation while you wait before you go through that door. You see, it's only after we admit that I may have incomplete information, I can't see the whole picture, I'm not wise enough to understand, that makes our idea of timing imperfect, that we can appreciate the protection offered by God's timing. When we're in a hurry, when we push through doors that should not yet be open, we expose ourselves to the fiery darts, the flaming arrows of the enemy. And so key point number 2 is that frustration with that door not opening in my timing. That frustration is transformed into faith only when we properly acknowledge the timekeeper and when we determine to proceed only through open doors. When doors stay closed, John is telling them there's a reason for it. There's a good reason, and we need to trust, we need to respect that. The writer of Ecclesiastes, Solomon, says there's a time for everything, and there's a season for every activity under the heavens. We just don't always understand that timing. Esther Lovejoy puts it really well. She says, God will not delay, nor will he be rushed. But while we are wearily waiting, he is working in ways that we cannot see or know. And so our trust is based on God's own assurance that when the time is right, he won't make us wait any longer. So we proceed in faith, and finally we hold our ground. Finally, the people are assured, you have little strength, and yet you obeyed my word, and you did not deny me. If you ever go over to England, especially to London, one of the most popular tourist destinations is Buckingham Palace, which is where the Queen and her family live, and some of the most elite guards in the Royal Army are the guards that are placed at Buckingham Palace. And there's quite a bit of pageantry associated with this. You have the guards who wear the very familiar uniforms there, and they have a particular routine that they're required to go through. They take 2-hour shifts, and only the best of the best are allowed to do this, but they have these shifts in the guard stands at the gates, and during that time they stand for a precise amount of time, and at the end of that precise amount of time they march back and forth, a precise number of steps for a precise distance, and then they go back to standing, and that's laid out exactly for that 2-hour shift that they take. You can see the daily orders that they are given, that they've all memorized, says this: standing easy is not permitted while a sentry is at post. In other words, relaxing is not permitted while you're on your post. Orders read out before each shift make it very clear. You may not eat, sleep, smoke, stand easy, sit, or lie down during your tour of duty. This particular portion of time belongs to the queen, and you're required to act accordingly during that particular time. This is the idea that John is trying to convey to the Christians. He is saying this point in time belongs to God, and you need to follow, you need to act accordingly. He talks about obedience here, and the Greek word used here, tereo, means to guard. It means to remain intact or to maintain. And in fact, the warden of a Roman prison was known as the tereo. It was somebody who was in charge of everybody, who was keeping the prisoners where they needed to be. He was supervising. Skip Moen talks about this word, and he says the idea is to watch something precious. It's to heed, it's to observe intently. In other words, it's not casual. It's not me just sitting back and kind of glancing every once in a while, but it's me actively guarding and participating in a vital process. John talks about this in his gospel as well when he's quoting Jesus. And Jesus says, all who love me will do what I say. And anyone who doesn't love me will not tereo me. He will not look over me. He will not treat me and my words as if they're precious. They won't be observed intently. You see, it's only after we acknowledge how vital God's guidelines are to our well-being that we then become able to consistently commit to living them out. God doesn't move us through doors until He sees that we're ready to live differently after we move through those doors. Final point is this. Assent, or this idea that I think many of us confuse with being Christians. This idea that, I believe the Bible. I go to church every once in a while. I'm a member of the church. That's assent. But assent is transformed into commitment, being a true follower of Jesus Christ when we allow the lawgiver to inhabit His rightful place in our lives and determine to live as His people. Ravi Zacharias explains it perfectly. He says, I have little doubt that the single greatest obstacle to the impact of the gospel has not been its inability to provide answers, but the failure on our part to live it out. We don't hold our ground. We don't allow ourselves to be transformed from, I can kind of go along with that, to, yes, I will live and die here. I will treat this with the gravity and the importance that it should hold in my life. Jeremiah, God prophesies through him in chapter 31, verse 33, and he speaks of the day when Jesus will return. And he says, I will put my law in their minds, and I will write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. And I'll know they're my people because my word is written on their hearts, and they're acting accordingly. Conclusion, 3 questions to ask yourself this coming week. Number 1, am I on the path to wisdom? Or am I sitting off to the side wondering why things aren't working out like they're supposed to? Number 2, am I content to wait for the doors to open before I proceed? Or am I going to be like that kid who keeps pushing on the pool door and getting frustrated and not moving forward in my faith? And finally, if I've moved through a particular door, am I holding fast to my faith? Am I holding on to God's standards for my life today?